In 1817, Missouri submitted a petition for statehood. It would eventually be admitted as the first state from the Louisiana Purchase, situated entirely west of the Mississippi River. But the path to statehood kicked up lots of dust. The following synopsis outlines the key events. April 9, 1818, an obscure New Hampshire congressman proposed prohibiting slavery in any new state. On December 18th of 1818, Henry Clay, a representative from Kentucky, introduced into the House an official memorial from Missouri asking permission to adopt the Constitution and form a state government. February 13th, 1819, Congress commenced debate on the Missouri Bill. On the same day, James Talmadge of New York proposed an amendment to the Missouri Bill to prohibit further introduction of slavery in Missouri, except for the punishment of crimes, that children born of slaves would be free, although they could be retained for servitude until age 25. The Talmadge Amendment thereby initiated what was known as the Missouri Crisis. In the spring of 1819, the House attached the Talmadge Amendment to the Missouri Bill, sent it to the Senate, and the Senate promptly rejected it. And thus began scrutiny of every article and section of the United States Constitution. On the surface, the debate was over the authority of Congress to place restrictions on condition for admission to the Union, but lurking beneath the surface of that veneer was the issue of slavery. In early 1820, the main bill was sent to the Senate from the House, where the Senate attached the Missouri Bill without any restrictions on slavery. February 17th of 1820, the Senate attached the Thompson Amendment to the main Missouri Bill to allow slavery in Missouri, but prohibit slavery in areas of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 36th degree and 32nd parallel. In February of 1820, the House rejected the bill with the Thompson Amendment, but they passed the bill with the Talmadge Amendment. On March 2nd of 1820, Henry Clay persuaded the House to accept the Missouri Maine Bill with the Thompson Amendment. On March 6th of 1820, President Monroe signed the bill. Now Missouri was permitted to draw up a constitution and form a state government. This was what was known later as the Missouri Compromise. So why is Missouri's statehood not recognized on March 6 of 1820? Well, back in Missouri, the state delegates worked feverishly to draw up a constitution, which was adopted on July 19th of 1820. On September 18th of 1820, the first state legislation convened at the Missouri Hotel in St. Louis. But when their representative John Scott and their two senators, Thomas Hart Benton and David Barton, arrived in Washington, D.C., Congress refused to seat them. The Missouri Constitution contained a clause, quote, to prevent free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in the state, end quote. Congress found that clause was in violation of Act 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, which states, quote, the citizen of each state is entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, end quote. The Senate attached what was known as the Eaton Provision, which essentially said that if Missouri attempted to pass any law to actually enact that part of their constitution, then that would be unconstitutional. They passed this without a vote on December 12th of 1820 and passed it over to the House. The House, on February 26th of 1821, on a vote of 87 for and 81 against, adopted the Eaton Provision. So this sent this measure back to the state of Missouri. Congress required Missouri not to alter their constitution, but to pass legislation promising to never pass future legislation authoring that clause in the Missouri Constitution. They did so, and it was referred to as the Solemn Public Act, and it was passed in June of 1821. On August 10th, 1821, President Monroe finally announced that Missouri had been admitted to the Union. The following dialogue is constructed of excerpts taken from the Missouri Gazette in 1819. Such letters to the editor were penned by various concerned citizens, including two gentlemen known as Sydney and Hampden, supposedly lawyers, and a farmer of St. Charles County.
To the Honorable, the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America, in Congress assembled, that your petitioners live within that part of the territory of Missouri which lies between the latitudes 36 degrees 30 minutes 40 degrees north, and between the Mississippi River to the east and the Osage boundary line to the west. They pray that they may be admitted into the Union of States within these limits.
May 19th, 1819. Mr. Printer, how did you get hold of that letter from the Virginia member of Congress? It is a precious document. I supposed it must have been dropped in the street by some emissary of the Virginia slave dealers. Surely they will soon learn to employ more careful agents. The cat is completely out of the bag. This Virginia congressman writes to his understrapper in St. Louis that we must oppose Congress, that Congress must yield in the end. He says we must refuse to become a state. But though some parts of the letter are obscure, yet its general drift is plain enough. If we refuse to become a state and thus keep a market open west of the Mississippi River where he can dispose of his worthless slaves, he does not care a cent how long we remain a territory. What makes this Virginian so anxious that Missouri should become a slave state or no state at all? Is it because slavery is a blessing? Do they want to get rid of their blessing? Is there something suspicious about that? The real fact, Mr. Printer, is this. Virginia and Kentucky will grow an abundance of Negroes. They must be sold or emancipated, for it would not do to let them remain in those states. Therefore, they want a market for them in Missouri. They know that slavery is a curse, and they want us to have a share of their curse and to pay them well for it, besides. A farmer of St. Charles County.
Talmadge Amendment, February 13th, 1819, and provided that the further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited, except for the punishment of crimes, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, and that all children born within the said state, after the admission thereof into the Union, shall be free at age 25 years.
May 5th, 1819. It was desirable that this statehood should be done at the least possible expense of regulation, because it is known that the government could not, consistently within its principles, be invested with power sufficient to bind states together against their will. The subject of slavery was, therefore, left to the several state governments exclusively, and measures were taken so to balance the power of these two portions of the Union that neither should exercise the overwhelming influence over the other. On this point, the Constitution was expressly declared to be the result of a compromise, which neither party had the right to disturb, and the balance was so ascertained as that neither should have power to disturb it. Now, what becomes of the care exercised by the framers of the Constitution for this purpose, if the present pretension of the House of Representatives be admitted? The whole of the territory west of the Mississippi is to be cut up into states, from which domestic slavery is to be excluded. These must be peopled entirely from the north, for southern immigrants could not afford to emancipate their slaves, and for the most part are too humane to sell them. Hampden.
May 19th, 1819. But the most heartrending thing of all is that this extensive region should never resound with the sound of the slave driver's scourge, that the shrieks of the abused and oppressed African should never be heard here, to gratify the ears and soothe the desponding spirits of the high-feeling enemies of usurpation and proud defenders of the rights of man. If anything can be more dreadful than this, it is the thought that the inhabitants of this extensive region grow rapidly in wealth and power without keeping among them a domestic enemy, ready to cut their throats at the first favorable moment. Yours to serve, a farmer of St. Charles County.
May 5th, 1819. But the effect upon the Senate would not be at all. The additions, therefore, to the House would soon be altogether in the northern interest, and it would not be long before their aggressions on the southern neighbors would be carried through that house. In such an event, after the evidences we have lately seen of their grasping spirit, we might expect a constitutional majority of states prepared to annihilate the slave representation of the southern states, to emancipate the slaves themselves. Can you believe that their love of the Union will make them acquiesce in the destruction of all that government is intended to protect? They will scatter the Constitution before the wind and take up arms. Hampden.
May 19th, 1819. The bugbear of the dismemberment of the Union, which Hampden has conjured up, has always been the hobby of every faction setting up pretensions unsupported by reason, justice, or common sense. But believe me, Mr. Printer, it is all nonsense. The honest and enlightened yeomanry, the farmers, who form the real strength of the country, will never countenance such a thing. They know the advantages of the Union, the folly of disunion too well to be led into the insurrection by the idle rant of lawyers and demagogues. A farmer of St. Charles County.
If the prevailing party in Congress have high aristocratic notions, they may secure the same character to the new state by confining the right of suffrage to the holders of large estates. If they are possessed by the demon of frantic democracy, they may extend it to every vagrant rabble that straggles through the country. After emancipating our slaves, they may bring them to the hustings and into the legislature and into the judgment seat. If a neighboring state be in such interest of the dominant faction of the day, they may make a week's residence of sufficient qualification to vote and send over a gang of neighbors to decide every election. Hampden.
Mr. Printer, occupied on my little farm, which I cultivate with my own hands, I have not had the leisure of late to go about among my neighbors to learn what's going on in the busy world. But last Sunday, after meeting was over, I commenced reading some of the publications of Mr. Hampden and of one Sydney, and then I read the publications of a farmer of St. Charles County. And then I got hold of another long piece of Mr. Hampden's, but as I fell asleep before I got halfway through it, and have not since had time to finish it, I cannot at present say much about the sentiments of these gentlemen. The other day, when I had been pretty hard at work in my field, replanting my corn and cursing the infernal crows, I set myself down in the shade to rest a while, and began to think about the hard work and trouble we farmers have to get along in the world. Then I began to wish I had half a dozen little Negroes to scare the crows from my corn. This brought slavery into my mind, and somehow or other I began to reflect on what I had read in the papers about Congress, Mr. Hampden, and about what the lawyers said. The man what makes speeches to the people of St. Louis and then publishes them for the edification of us farmers. Well, I began to argue with myself and ask questions until my brain became as fatigued as my body. I determined that I would someday go to St. Louis and ask a lawyer. But then methinks, dang it, who knows but I may stumble on Squire Sydney or Squire Hampden, who are lawyers, they say. So I resolved to write to you, Mr. Printer, and request to get some honest, disinterested lawyer, without a fee, mind you, to satisfy my doubts. Had Congress, instead of wishing to keep the slaves from amongst us, passed our state bill, conditioned that in framing our Constitution, the principles of slavery shall be recognized and admitted, that is, the people of Missouri shall never make any laws prohibiting or restricting slavery, would such an act on the part of Congress had been a violation of the Constitution, or the Treaty of Cession, or the rights and interests of the people of Missouri. A farmer of St. Louis County.
At a meeting of a number of citizens of the town and county of St. Louis at the courthouse on Saturday the 15th, and pursuant to the recommendation of the grand jury of the Superior Court, for the purpose of expressing their opinion of the powers of Congress of the United States to impose conditions on the admission of this territory into the Union of the States, at which Colonel Alexander McNair was chosen president, and David Barton secretary, the following resolutions were adopted.
Resolved, that the Congress of the United States has no right to control the provisions of a state constitution, except to preserve its character. Resolved, the attempt of the majority of the House of Representatives in the last Congress to prevent further introduction and continuance of slavery into the future state of Missouri was equally contrary to the rights of the state and to the welfare of the slaves themselves. Resolved, that the right of the Missouri Territory to be admitted into the Union of States depends not upon the will of Congress, but upon the Treaty of Cession and the principles of federal constitution. Resolved, that a constitution so formed cannot be disapproved by Congress or by any other cause than for anti-republican feature, and if disapproved upon any other pretext, it will be the equivalent to an attempt to exclude the territory of Missouri from the Federation of States.
June 30th, 1819. The Intelligencer says, "We confess that we citizens of the territory, consulting its future happiness and safety, its internal strength and political weight in the Confederacy, we should be opposed to the toleration of slavery within it, any longer than is necessary to the gradual abolition of that which already exists." Well then, what have they been making all this fuss about? Surely it is not necessary to introduce any more slavery in an effort to get rid of what we now have. The restriction which passed the House of Representatives ought, therefore, to have received their support. Say nothing about the constitutional objections. For if Congress had a right to require the people of Louisiana to establish trial by jury and to keep their records in English, they certainly have as good a right to require the people of Missouri to prohibit the importation of slaves. A farmer of St. Charles County.
At a meeting of the citizens of Montgomery County in the territory of Missouri, held at the house of John Tice on the 28th day of April, 1819, after considerable discussion, with the following declarations and resolutions were unanimously agreed to.
Resolved, that we are constitutionally entitled to admission in the Union of the States, a free, sovereign, and independent member thereof, without any other restriction or condition than that our Constitution shall be truly and entirely republican, equally with any other territory which has been admitted. Resolved, that the restriction attempted to be imposed upon the people of this territory as a condition of their admission into the federal union is a daring stretch of power and usurpation of the most sacred rights, unprecedented, unconstitutionally, and in open violation of the third article of the Treaty of Cession entered into with France.
The editorial of that paper says, "If the effect of this restriction would be to diminish the number of slaves in the United States, or to improve their condition, we should have sincerely rejoiced in it, but its only effect will be to concentrate that population within a narrower space. I do not know, Mr. Printer, that we are under any obligation to convert this territory into a Botany Bay for the reception of such slaves as the people of slave states wish to part with. If they have more slaves than they dare to keep, it is their concern, not ours. They can at any time emancipate them and send them back to Africa. The Colonization Society will pay the expense of transportation, and perhaps they will also pay the master something towards the value of his slaves. Mr. Speaker Clay holds a high office in that society. I have strong hopes that his patriotic feelings will induce him to use his powerful influence and part of his immense fortune in promoting its benevolent objects." A farmer of St. Charles County.
In pursuance of a request contained in the 8th resolution of a meeting held in the town of St. Louis on the 15th day of May, 1819, recommended public meetings, the following resolutions were read and unanimously agreed to at St. Ferdinand Township this 5th day of June, 1819.
Resolved, that the amendment to the Missouri State Bill in the House of Representatives of the Congress of the United States meets our full approbation as being more conducive to the present happiness and future prosperity of this fair and growing country. Resolved, that slavery, contrary to the term freedom, and it is also contrary to the laws of nature, and one nation or one individual should be compelled to serve another unjustly. Resolved, that it is one of the greatest evils we have to regret at this present day in the United States, and if not protested against in this growing country, it will eventually end in entailed hereditary misery on our future posterity, and bring upon us their just censure, as well as the judgment of a just but angry God.
May 5th, 1819. I proceed to show that Congress have not the right to dictate to us on any subject, because it is forbidden by the Constitution of the United States. The 10th article of the amendments to the Constitution declares that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved for the states respectively, or to the people. This provision renders it necessary for those who advocate for the pretensions of the House of Representatives to look for their warrant in the Constitution. Mr. Taylor pretends that he has found it in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, which declares that the Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belongings of the United States. Can it be pretended that the United States have any farther property in our slaves than they have in the slaves of any of the states, or further property in our lands patented by them or granted by the Spanish government than in any other land in the Union, to which the owner holds a complete title? Sydney.
The Missourian intimates that Congress might attain their objective sooner by suppressing not only the Richmond Enquirer, but all other newspapers possessing sufficient independence to inquire into and expose their iniquitous proceedings. I take the liberty to inform Mr. Missourian that the Friends of Freedom never attack the liberty of the press, either by mobs or other means. The traffickers in human flesh have the exclusive honor of such transactions. You might sooner arrest the current of the Mississippi with a mound of sand than you can stop the progress of the cause of liberty in a country where the press is free.
As to the facts, the writer is not a St. Charles farmer. There is no such farmer here as he is, no man who, with the same opportunities of information, understands and values his rights so little. There is no such neighborhood in St. Charles as that described. There is no such man in the territory who can say with truth that his neighbors would be willing to submit to this claim of Congress, even if they knew it to be a usurpation. These falsehoods are of no consequence among us ourselves. They are known to be false, and they are a part of a system of usurpation. A faction in Congress wishes to rob us of our lands and Negroes, and they employ traitors among ourselves or spies among themselves to assume false characters that may assist in the deception. As for the information of people at a distance, I state that between the date of that piece and the time it came into the printer's hands, the state of the weather, the roads, and the waters cut off all communication between St. Louis and St. Charles, that the most acute observation has been incapable of discovering in St. Louis or any St. Charles man who could or would have written it. Sydney.
Sydney seems to think that if he can make out that my piece was not written by a St. Charles farmer, all the arguments contained in it would fall to the ground, of course. He therefore proves by his own positive territory that I am not a St. Charles farmer. Methinks I can see the acute and learned Sydney traversing the streets and alleys of St. Louis, entering all the houses and accosting every man he meets with, "Are you the vile traitor who dared to write a piece, a farmer of St. Charles County?" But perhaps he did not put the question to any but the well-dressed, and such as appeared to be lawyers. For if I am not mistaken, Sydney is one of those who think that talents are always accompanied by a fine coat. If he had seen me dressed in my leather hunting shirt, linsey pantaloons, coarse shoes, and old hat, I do not think he would have suspected that I was the man who could or would have written a farmer of St. Charles County. Well, after trudging all over St. Louis in search of me, without being able to find me, it was very natural that lawyer Sydney should be in a dreadful passion, and while in this passion it was natural for him to say that Congress wished to rob him of his lands and Negroes, and that I was a spy or traitor in their employ, a farmer of St. Charles County.
Sir, your correspondent, who subscribes himself a farmer of St. Charles County, seems to take honor to himself for the attention which his essays have excited. He is much flattered at being taken to be something different from what he professes to be, and does not wonder that those who should see him in his hunting shirt and with his rifle in his hand should think him incapable of writing so well. I am not at all desirous of disturbing his self-complacency. I am never disposed to swear or insult, or to evade the point of argument by calling my adversary a fool. I freely declare that I think his piece well written. I know many farmers who could write at least as well, but it is easy for a man to glance his eye over the country and select from among individuals capable of writing as well as he does, those from whom such sentiments as he avows can be expected to proceed. Such men are generally not obscure, and the mind easily turns to them. In the county of St. Charles I have sought them in vain. The farmer, it seems, takes me for a lawyer. I sincerely wish that I could bestow on this great legal question talents worthy of a member of that profession. If the farmer has discovered and traces of such talent, it is more than I can do. But I anticipate his only answer, as I do not mean to reply to him, which will be something about quibbling, and merely ask the courteous reader to look back and see if he can find a quibble in anything I have written. But he must be excused for not believing that such intelligence as he clearly possesses, associated with the daily use of the hunting shirt and rifle, would have ever given birth to sentiments so servile as he avows. If any man in the county entertains them, I frankly declare that I have not heard him. Sydney.
I had not room in my last letter to notice all the fine things the Missourian has said about me in the Enquirer. He says my sentiments are base, spiritless, abject, contemptible, and servile, and insinuates that I cannot bear the smell of gunpowder. I understand well what he would be at, but he will be disappointed. Neither the Missourian nor the Enquirer man shall ever catch me on the sandbar. I am a little surprised, Mr. Printer, at the difference of opinion between Lawyer Sydney and Lawyer Hampden. Sydney says my pieces are well written, while Hampden declares that I have descended to, quote, a style of sneering and vulgar ribaldry, which no man will use who can use it better. For my own part, I think Sydney is the better judge of the two. The lawyers have made dreadful complaints that the publication of my pieces would ruin them. My object was to prevent them from humbugging and deluding the people into a Hartford convention or a whiskey insurrection. I perceive that the Enquirer man is still racking his brain to find the author of the vile pieces signed a farmer of St. Charles County. But if the cause of slavery is so just, so pure, and so righteous as the Enquirer man pretends, why does he not refute my arguments and prove to the world that the Congress of 1776 were mistaken when they said that liberty was the inalienable right of all men, and demonstrate one class of men have an inalienable right to hold another class of men in perpetual slavery? Why does he spend his time in trying to make people believe that my pieces were written by this man or that man, when if my arguments were wrong, he could refute them in half the time? A farmer of St. Charles County.
Missouri Compromise, March 2nd, 1820. Section 8. And it be further enacted that in all that territory ceded by France to the United States under the name of Louisiana, which lies north of 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude, not included within the limits of the state, contemplated by this act, slavery and involuntary servitude, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall be and is hereby forever prohibited, provided always that any person escaping into the same, from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any state or territory in the United States, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as foresaid.
A letter from Thomas Jefferson to Representative John Holmes of Massachusetts, regarding the Missouri Compromise, April 22nd, 1820. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed at the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. A geographical line, coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper.